Good evening, everybody. This is now official. I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the founding board member of Center for Common Ground. Can't remember the name of my own organization. And welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the fourth webinar in our series, Voting in Troubled Times. And boy, oh boy, 2020 is going to be the election that was. It's almost like every day we hear new information about new troubles and new problems that voters are going to encounter in 2020. Well, tonight we have some very special guests who are going to be talking about what we can expect in October for states that have early voting, September and August for states that still have late primaries coming up, and then the big day in November. So without further ado, this is some information about our series. So our original series started in May, and it was COVID-19 and the 2020 elections. July 9th, we did the moral imperative, where we talked about the involvement of faith leaders in what I am now calling the new coalition of conscience. That was something that Dr. King talked about. Tonight is what voters will encounter in November. On September 24th at 8 p.m., same time, same place, the fifth webinar in our series, The Shifting Voter Landscape, will be here. And we will be joined by Rachel Bidkofer, who is an election strategist. And I used some of Rachel's numbers for our target states when we were choosing back in November where our focus would be literally in a year. And October 22nd will be our final webinar, the final dash. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Lemus. Gabby, unmute, please. Woo. All right, Gabby, here, I'm going to help you unmute. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this fourth plenary session of the Center for Common Ground's Voting in Troubled Times virtual series. I am the Center for Common Ground's co-chair along with Reverend Rodney Sadler, and we are very honored to have all of you. And as Andrea said, every day we learn some new reason that to make the public concerned about the upcoming elections and the potential for voter suppression. You know, just this past Monday, we learned that a lawsuit was filed in Nevada seeking to block state efforts to send mail-in ballots to all registered voters. Today, this morning actually, CBS News ran a clip where President Trump said he opposed congressional Democrats' demands to boost funding for the U.S. Postal Service, because he said the money would be used to facilitate mail-in voting for November's elections, which is something that he has stated several times that he does not support. But it's not just mail-in ballot questions. In state after state, we are witnessing a number of additional challenges, everything from the results of established and historical gerrymandering efforts to new complicated poll equipment at the polls, as in Georgia and South Carolina. We're also seeing aging poll workers who will be particularly vulnerable to the coronavirus, and really a dearth of trained poll workers to replace them should they decide they do not want to work the polls. The elimination of early voting sites in some states, and even as we witnessed in Puerto Rico on Sunday, no ballots at the polls on election days. They're going to have to reschedule. So essentially, the validity of the upcoming election is already being placed into question. You know, the president himself declared that the 2020 election will likely be the most inaccurate and fraudulent in history. and he even floated the idea of possibly delaying the vote, which we all know constitutionally he can't do without majority votes from both the House and Senate. But the fact that this is even being mentioned out loud can begin to really muddy the waters, and it raises anxiety. Now, not everything has been bad. The Supreme Court today also stated that it allowed a consent decree to go forward so that Rhode Island voters, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, could cast mail-in ballots without in-person witness verification. And our friends at Common Cause signed a consent decree along with others agreeing not to enforce the witness requirement in Rhode Island law. But the bottom line of all of these actions and rumors and statements that are being made is that what we're seeing is a lot of confusion, which explains in part why there's so many of you on here tonight. You know, voter turnout reached a 20-year low in 2016. Only about 55% of voting age citizens cast ballots in that cycle. Now, we don't believe that that's what's going to happen this time. This year, marked by a recession and racial uprising following the killing of George Floyd, has sparked a surge among mostly young and progressive Americans, many of whom will be voting for the first time in this election. This is why the Center for Common Ground's work is so critical. It's why we're here, to support this awakening. And all of these issues that I have just enumerated are also why we felt strongly that we really needed to have this conversation today. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us again, and thank our new friends who are just joining us for the first time tonight. So on that note, I would like you to all welcome our speakers, Vashti Hinton from North Carolina Common Cause, Professor Duncan Buell from the University of South Carolina, and Michael Thurman, the CEO of DeKalb County, Georgia. I hope I didn't mispronounce that, for what promises to be a very rich conversation. So to get the ball rolling, let me ask all of you, and thank you and welcome you as speakers, but let me ask all of you to really give us your take on what is going on and what you've been doing to ensure that voters in your state get a chance to vote and have their vote counted. Let's start with Vashti from Common Cause. Vashti? Oh, one thing, just a brief reminder, please keep your opening remarks to 5-6 minutes. Our audience will be able to ask questions immediately after your comments. And audience, please submit them in the chat box once it opens back up, and one of our volunteers will get them to me. Thank you so much. Okay, now Vashti, it's you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Just give me 1 second. And quickly just go through a few slides that I have put together just to kind of give y'all like a snapshot of some of the battles that we've been fighting here in North Carolina, but to also talk about how we've been fighting back and how we're planning to fight back this upcoming election as well. So like Gabriella said, I am from Common Cause, North Carolina. More specifically, I work with the HBCU program. So I work with Black and Brown communities in North Carolina across the state. And so let's get started here. Let me see where I want to start. Yeah, we'll just go here. Sorry about that. Oops. I'm over here having trouble. But yeah, these are, so the most important court case I really want to draw y'all's attention to is the very last one. I'm sure everybody knows about Shelby v. Holder in that court case. We saw the, sorry, my computer's acting really strange. I apologize, my apologies. Shelby v. Holder, we saw that the Supreme Court gutted the key portions of the Voting Rights Act. And those portions kind of protected voters and kept voters from having any kind of discriminatory practices that kept them or prohibited them from getting to the polls. And then we saw in North Carolina, at least, we saw this bill called the Monster ID law that came up, right? And we saw in fact, Reverend William Barber, he said that these tactics actually brought us further back in terms of like protections for Black and brown and poor folks when it came to access to the polls. And so because of all these things, and then we had these different court cases, North Carolina versus NAACP versus McCoy, which we challenged that. They were trying to get rid of pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. And so then we get to gerrymandering, and we see that North Carolina, one of the things that happened in North Carolina was that the largest HBCU in North Carolina, North Carolina A&T State University, not even just North Carolina, the largest HBCU in the country, was actually split right down the middle of campus. And I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the Harfler documents that were put out over the summer and earlier this year. It was done with almost surgical-like precision, they said. And what happened was, and this was this way for several years. So students came in, my sister actually, she went to A&T. She started at A&T in 2016, and literally her entire collegiate career, she had never voted in an election that was fair, in which her vote counted 100%. And so to kind of go over, I was asked to kind of quickly talk about gerrymandering and what it is and how it happens. I'm trying to go as quick as I can. Just thinking about like how these ideas represent, like the cake and the donut represent like ideas and policies and thoughts, political leaning, representation, etc. What do we believe? And we see here we have the two pieces of cake and the donut, which represent, the different populations of voters. And the arrow represents, our vote. And, here we have, the donut district gets broken up, and now we have just these two cake districts, which neither of which represent the donut, what the donut is or what the donut may want. So that's kind of an example that we use to kind of explain to people, what is, gerrymandering. These are the maps over the years that we've had. And as you can see, North Carolina has been gerrymandered for almost about 20 years, I would say. I mean, if you look at District 12 and even looking at the entire map, it is very, it's been messed up for a long time. And so, it took a while, and I'm thankful. I want to give a shout out to my boss, Bob Phillips. He's been fighting this fight as well as other people in North Carolina, fighting this fight in North Carolina for a long time to get our state lines drawn properly. And so as you can see here, in 2013, we know Alma Adams, she was in Black people in North Carolina. And then had in 2017, where they were told to redraw the lines. And even now we have, a map that they've drawn, and A&T thankfully is no longer gerrymandered. Thankfully, thanks to the students and the organizers and the people that organized on the ground and fought back, and the court cases that we had in the court system to kind of say, hey, this is not okay. The court case did go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they knocked it back down, saying they basically felt like they didn't have any jurisdiction in this matter. And so, or they felt like, this was not an issue that, they felt was, they should speak on. And so it came back down to the Supreme Court, but we are thankful that we have, a system that sometimes works, right? Our North Carolina Supreme Court actually ruled that this was a racial gerrymander, and that our North Carolina State General Assembly, they had to redraw these lines. And so we're really thankful for that. This is a picture of some of the students who helped to organize and fight back and say, hey, we do not want our campus and our community split. I don't know what you all know about Greensboro, North Carolina, but the east side of Greensboro, where A&T is smack down right in the middle of a Black community. And as we all know, anytime lines are drawn in for any district, it is supposed to embody or embody people who have like interest and similar interest, and that's not what was happening. I mean, you can very clearly see that this campus was split in half, which has never been done before, as far as any of us know, at least. And so I think that this is a really great example of how people fight back and organized over it was a long fight, actually, People think, this fight was only for a few years, but there have been people on the ground fighting against gerrymandering and illegal gerrymanders, ones that specifically dilute the voices and dial out the voices of Black and brown and poor people in North Carolina for a very long time. And let's see my next slide. So sorry. I think that was it. So yeah, and my name is Vashti Hinton Smith again. I'm with Common Cause, and hopefully I tried to give y'all as much information as I could in 5 to 6 minutes. Hopefully that kind of gives you guys a good glimpse into like some of those struggles we've been having in North Carolina. And I will add, y'all were talking about vote by mail earlier. That is something that we've also been dealing with, trying to figure out what do we tell students. Obviously we know what to tell them, but a lot of people, a lot of organizations are like, we're gonna do vote by mail. And we have even Black people in our communities here who are like, oh, I wanna do vote by mail. But some people are very, particularly Black people, we're very reluctant to use vote by mail because of all the extreme voter tactics and the attempts to silence us and keep our votes shut out. All these things that have been happening, all the voter suppression that's been happening to Black and brown people for a very long time. So trying to figure out how do we get people to understand or how to trust in the process, right? And I think that, that is something that we need to talk about. I think, over the years, we've seen so many cases and stories of people going to using vote by mail and then finding out later, oh, your vote didn't even count, or your ballot never even made it to the ballot box, And so how do we reestablish trust in our electoral process, but also how do we create an electoral process that is fair, and democratic and works for everybody? That is the conversation we've been having. And none of us have the answer, but I think that, together we can absolutely come up with something and figure out how do we make this system work for us the way it's meant to be. And so that's why, we do the work that we do. We organize, we fight back, we call State Board of Elections, we call our representatives, we make petitions last year at A&T, WSSU, and Fayetteville State, all of these schools, these students created their own petitions. They had 500 plus signatures, most of them, and they sent them over to the Board of Elections and they said, hey, we need a polling site on campus. We need a fair process for our students. We need to make sure every vote that is cast on our campuses is counted. And that's what we saw, and we saw the results of that last year. So I think, certainly, if students can do it, we all can. And I think that, they say, I think the quote is, and the youngest of us shall lead us, or the least of us shall lead us all. And I think that's really important for us to remember in this moment, just to, keep up the fight. And I'm not trying to sound cliche or corny, but I do think that's important for us to remember, this is a fight that is gonna, fighting for a true democracy, or to live in a true democracy, is certainly a fight that we'll be fighting for a long time. So, and it's a sprint. I mean, it's a endurance race, not a sprint. So thank you. Hopefully that was, I tried.
That was great, Vashti. Thank you so much. And you're right, it is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yes.
So there you go. So please, Michael, let's hand it over to you in the state of Georgia. Please welcome.
Well, thank you. And first, let me thank and congratulate the Center for Common Ground for your visionary decision to engage in this national effort to fight against voter suppression. Madam Co-Chair and all of you who prayed and sung and collaborated to make this happen, I offer to you my congratulations and really just my heartfelt thanks. First and foremost, here in Georgia, we've spent the last 3 weeks, really, 2 in particular, celebrating the life of a living legend, which is Congressman John Lewis, who gave his life to ensure that all people, particularly Black people and others, all people of color, have equal access to the voting booth. And in the face of really a national effort, very intentional and purposeful, to suppress the vote of people of color, poor people, we must not grow weary in our good doings. And one of the things that Congressman Lewis is famous for, and I've heard him tell me on multiple occasions, that we should not lose the opportunity to get in good trouble whenever we had a chance. And fighting to assure equal access to the voting booth, to being registered, and to participating in the democratic process is the best good trouble any of us on this call or in our lives can participate in. Whenever you are in a political jurisdiction where there is an intense struggle for power, which we are now in this nation and in the South in particular and other states around this country, where dispossessed people or people who have been without power began to, through demographic evolution and shifts, place themselves in a position where they have access to power. Forces who hold those reins of power will engage in a systemic effort to limit access, to dilute power, and to do whatever's in their arsenal to suppress the vote. This is not by happenstance, it is strategic. It is planned, and quite frankly, we need to approach it in a way where we cannot afford to fail. Here in Georgia, 3 weeks ago, we had what has been described as an election meltdown. We had a Republican Secretary of State who, in majority African-American precincts throughout Metro Atlanta and other parts of Georgia, intentionally in many ways sought to prohibit and restrict and dilute African-American voters. Here in DeKalb County, we're the most Democratic county in the state of Georgia. We have 750,000 residents. I'm the elected CEO of DeKalb County, and we are fighting, and we just had a runoff, and I met with my board of elections. The first thing we recognize is that the Secretary of State had purchased a new voting system, very complex system that, quite frankly, was outlawed in Texas, believe it or not, and we're using it here in Georgia. So our election chair, Sam Tillman, we're recruiting much younger poll workers to assist us in our polling places because these are very complicated electronic touch machine voters. So we're recruiting much younger voters to be poll workers on election day. I've deployed my IT department to ensure that the polling places can actually support the new machinery. Many of the polling places are older and they have obsolete electrical wiring or not enough bandwidth to support the system. So now we are doing deep evaluation prior to November to make sure these polling places can support the technology that's been deployed. And the last thing, and we'll talk about other things in particular, DeKalb received $125 million in CARES Act funding because of COVID-19. We intend to provide hazard pay for all poll workers because what we found was that many senior citizens, because African Americans in general and seniors in particular are disproportionately impacted by the virus, we had to then come up with a strategy where poll workers had to choose between their health and their life and working on election day. So we have to take steps, number one, to recruit a different cadre of workers and advocate, because these men and women who serve as poll workers are literally putting their health on the line because they become forward-facing public servants. So those are three things I'll mention, and I'll come back, Ms. Gabriella, and talk in more detail. But thank you so much for inviting me, but more importantly, thank you all for having the vision to have the discussion and develop the strategy so that we can implement and make a difference on election day.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think that's absolutely on point. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Buell in South Carolina.
So
Professor.
much of what I will say is very similar to what was just said. I have been a computer science professor at the University of South Carolina since 2000. Starting in 2010, I was able to obtain the election data from our previous electronic voting computers. And I went through and found out that in fact we weren't following federal HAVA law, we weren't keeping all the data, we were counting votes twice, we weren't counting all the votes. Some of this may have been intentional, a lot of it was just that we had a very complicated computer system that we turned over to people who didn't do it every day and who came from a demographic averaging 73 years of age that isn't necessarily the right group of people to turn over a complicated computer system to on something like election day, which we know is going to be chaos. There's just no way that a real election day will fail to be anything other than chaotic. We also have a new system. We bought a different system. We paid about half as much as Georgia did. And my own county, I'm from Richland County, which includes Columbia. It's the third largest county. We have about 265,000 registered voters. Charleston is a little bit bigger, and then Greenville is another 15% bigger. We have had one problem after another for the last 10 years. We are now on, I think, our 8th election director in 10 years. And we have had, so our June 9th primary would have given us the election meltdown lead, except that Georgia seemed to have even more problems than we did. We normally have 149 precincts. A lot of the polling places were churches and those weren't open. We only managed to get enough poll workers to staff, I think, 79 polling locations. So we combined 5 precincts into 1 polling location and sent 13,000 voters to the same place with not nearly enough staff and hardware to manage an election. After that, we have gotten any number of questions. I work very closely with the League of Women Voters here, and they have produced questions from voters. I sat through 4 hours of a Democratic Party hearing complaining about things that went wrong. Right now, our assumption is that election day might as well be tomorrow. We are going out after younger poll workers. We're working hard. Well, the first thing we need are the poll clerks, which is what the person at the top in a polling location is called in South Carolina. And then we need a bunch of what we call poll managers, who are the rest of the people. We're trying to get more. We are encouraging absentee balloting, and there is a real problem with absentee balloting because almost every state does it differently. And when people hear on the national news all of these things that are going on about drop boxes and mail-in and witness signatures, they automatically assume that there's some sort of standard. We are the only advanced democracy that votes in 3,000 different jurisdictions with 3,000 different sets of rules. Pretty much every other country has at least a single standard for how the election is conducted. And part of our confusion is because every state has different laws. Georgia is different from South Carolina and is different from North Carolina. So my advice to people is start now, find out what the rules are, contact the elections office, contact the League of Women Voters, make sure that you have the correct information for your jurisdiction, because it's going to be different for a lot of other people. And some of these things are really subtle. Our June primary, the legislature said that, well, the court case said they couldn't require a witness signature. The legislature added fear of COVID as a legitimate reason for absentee voting in the primary, and specifically did not do that for the November general. They're coming back in September and they may fix that. But as I said just before, we are permitted only one ballot box per county, and there are various rules in different states about what is called ballot harvesting. You know, how many ballots can one person return to that drop box, and for whom, and under what circumstances? It's necessary to know these laws, because otherwise you can have your vote suppressed just by somebody telling you something which may or may not be true. But unless you know chapter and verse in the law, you're going to have trouble rebutting somebody's comments. And I will essentially quit there because I think we're running a little over time. But it really is, I'm on the Elections Commission after we failed to count all the votes in November 2018. And we are trying to work hard to make sure that 2020 is successful. And we have a new election director that we got from Alabama, fabulous young woman from a bigger county. But it's a problem. It's going to be chaos when you think about all of these people going out to distributed locations, not doing something they do every day, and then voters showing up possibly in the wrong place, possibly intentionally in the wrong place, and you get lines. And with lines, there is a suppression. Long lines suppress the vote. Long lines suppress the minority vote more than the white vote. And that's basically been proven. The people who would prefer to vote early, who would prefer to vote absentee, certainly in-person absentee, tend to be those who want to choose when they're going to stand in line. And that's an issue that you have to take into account. I'll quit.
Unmute, Gabby.
You're muted.
I did it. I'm terrible. Okay. So what I was trying to say was just to synthesize some points that I heard about what all you've shared with us. The first that Michael just mentioned is the issue of poll closings. That the poll closings could be really problematic. And in many cases, it sounds like it's up to even close to 50% are being shut down. So maybe encourage absentee voting per state, although each state handles it differently, and there are really no standards for voting in this manner, and there are over 3,000 sets of rules, more or less. Second thing I heard loud and clear is that the voting systems have become very complicated, that it's expensive, and that the skills of poll workers may not be able to manage these new systems, which in turn can create additional chaos while voting. But I also heard something optimistic, which is that sometimes the system does work and that we can push back, like the case of gerrymandering in North Carolina. So we should remain hopeful. I would say I'm going to open up with the first question, and hopefully our audience is, the chat box has been opened and the audience is sending in some questions as well. But my first question is, are there still, from your perspective as experts in this space, are there still opportunities to push for what's needed, like transparent county level planning of elections administration, what I just mentioned about early voting and you know, the number of polling sites and times of operation, the issue of a secure and accessible ballot drop boxes, poll worker training, of course, that we're going to need, especially when there's changes in technology. So I'll just open it up. Anybody want to hop in?
Oh, I can, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with regard to transparency, many states nominally say that the counting has to be done publicly, and not all of the states who have that in their law actually manage to make that happen. Sometimes that public observation of the count is from 20 feet away through a small window in a door, so they don't actually affect the intent of the law. I'm a big believer in transparency. I think I mean, our election data in South Carolina has been public. North Carolina keeps its cast vote record secret. We tried to get it once, not legal. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, to add on to that as well. I think one of the things that I thought about is that so in North Carolina we actually have a shortage of poll workers, and I've always believed, and even before COVID at least, we always tried to encourage, you know, younger people and Black people to work as poll workers in the community or to volunteer. I've always believed that the poll worker holds just as much responsibility in making sure the process is as democratic as possible as the actual the Board of Elections, right? Because they're the ones processing the ballots. They're the ones, you know, reading through the information, interpreting it as well, and entering it into the computer and all these different things. And so I think that in this time of COVID, one of the things that we've been doing is, of course, we've been telling people not to ask college students to volunteer or to work as poll workers if they don't have health insurance, because you know, the liability issues and, you know, the different things that go along with that. And so I think that, you know, just us being like cognizant of that and making sure that, you know, I don't know if there's some way to do this or not, but, you know, people who do work as poll workers, making sure that, you know, they have access to that kind of thing. And I know in North Carolina in particular, we've been trying to find and ask people who care about this, who care about the electoral process. You know, if you have health insurance, please work, please volunteer, do what you can. But just being cognizant of that. So that is something I just wanted to throw into the conversation while we're talking about transparency and poll workers and all these different things. And not to add another caveat or another, you know, wrench in all this, but I do think that is something, you know, for us to think about as well. And also just thinking about, you know, at-risk populations. It's not just, it's the elderly, but it's also, you know, Black folks. And I think about particularly like young Black students who, for being honest and transparent, a lot of times do not have health care, for being honest, especially like in these rural areas. I work at a college called Livingstone College. It's a very rural, I don't know if y'all know where Salisbury is, but it's a very rural area, very small town in North Carolina. And, you know, a lot of those students, they don't have health care, you know, so going to ask them to work as a poll worker, although we may need them right now, it's a lot of different layers that I think go into this conversation. But I do think like the first step is like proper education, like we're saying, and like making sure that people, you know, aren't putting themselves at risk, but also finding ways to engage people who kind of fall in that middle space. They're not very young, but they're not, you know, considered elderly or an at-risk population, and seeing and asking them to say, hey, can you please go work or volunteer as a poll worker during the election? And so I think this is about activating. One of the things we've been talking about in my office is just trying to activate maybe a group of people who maybe has not been as engaged in the past, right? You know, that 18 to 35-year-old range of young people who may, they aren't in college per se, but they have health insurance and they have the capacity. So just trying to figure that out as well. But just also making sure people are cognizant of the risk, and also making sure folks are educating themselves and trying to get an understanding of what's needed during this time as well. So
first, I would refocus on what Professor Buell said earlier. Each state, and to some extent, each county or city is unique in terms of how elections are administered. Mm-hmm. So you really have to do the research and understand, and I know we have a national audience. So understanding voting laws, rules, and regulations at the state level, but in Georgia, and I'm sure all over, elections are really managed at the local level. So there has to be a local engagement with your Board of Elections and registrars and with the people who are making the decision. And most states throughout the South, with the exception of North Carolina being one of the exceptions, we have Republican administrations in control of the state apparatus, but within the state, there are Democratic majorities such as DeKalb. And so there's just a tension that exists between these Democratic majority, and not just even in terms of cities or counties, but sometimes it's even voting precincts and those who have the reins of power at the state level. And so understanding that dynamic and being able to use the system, encourage people to vote early, whether it's by mail or early voting, is always better than facing that election day crapshoot in terms of whether or not there'll be a line or whether or not the machines will be working properly. So those are just three things that immediately we can do. I think that would be extremely helpful. Voting early, knowing the men and women who serve on your Board of Elections and Registration, knowing the chair and engaging them and assisting them and encouraging them to make sure that all things are being done to assure access to the polling places.
Let me add one thing, and I suspect Mr. Thurmond is going to agree with this. If you want something that you can do as activists to make the election work better, the voters also need to contact whoever is in charge of the money in the county, like the county council, because taking care of all of this, when we add another vote, what we call them satellite location for in-person absentee, it's going to cost us $20,000, and that won't necessarily have been in the budget. And the county council, if that's where the money comes from, has to be convinced that this is worth doing, especially this year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor.
So there's a number of accountability questions that have come in. I'm going to bunch three together. The first is with relationship to the people who may have to count votes, for example, provisional and mail-in ballots. Who selects these individuals? And then related to that is a concern that the many mail-in ballots and provisional ballots are thrown out because of signatures matching, those kinds of things. And then the third point relates to the new technology. And for example, in Florida, they were saying that the new equipment at the polling sites is via Wi-Fi. So hackability and what is being done to reduce those vulnerabilities.
I'll try the first two, but I want the professor to answer the third one.
He's the computer expert.
He's the computer
just
expert.
Announced today that the Federal Election Assistance Commission has chastised ES&S, which is the largest manufacturer. They control about 45% of the national market, for suggesting in their advertising that their optical scanners with Wi-Fi modems have been EAC certified. They have not. The ones without the modems have been certified. The ones with the modems are not. And it was just today that the EAC announced reprimands against ES&S. I'm a computer science professor. I believe that elections should be done using the absolute minimum level of technology possible, because you've just got to keep it simple. And Wi-Fi, if it's Wi-Fi, it's hacked. If it's on the internet, it was Robert Mueller 15, 18 years ago said there are only two kinds of computers on the internet: those that have been hacked and those that have not yet been hacked. So if it's on the net, you have to assume that it's attackable, especially when it's elections, because people know exactly when they have to go hack it. So, and I'll let Mr. Thurmond answer the first two.
Thank you. Well, our director of elections in the CAB is Ms. Hamilton, and Sam Tillman is the chair. They hire poll workers, managers, those who actually count absentee ballots. But let me go back to something Professor said. There has to be a budget, but the budget is recommended by myself and approved by the Board of Commissioners. And in tight budget environments that we're operating in now, that's going to have a major impact on how much is invested and how much expansion takes place in any department, including elections, although it's a high priority in the CAB. As far as counting absentee ballots, we had two episodes of COVID and positive infections with employees who were working to count absentee ballots. That took over a week after election day to get a final census or tally on the absentee ballots. And one of the things that we do in DeKalb is we decide to mail absentee ballots to all voters who are registered, active and inactive. In Georgia, during the primary, the Secretary of State mails over 6 million ballots to active voters. So that's a question too, that even if you have the mail in voting, a question needs to be asked in your state or in your county as to whether or not the mailing will go to active and inactive voters. So that's a critical point, and I'll stop there.
That is a new. Sorry, I'm taking notes. Well, we're getting so many questions, I can barely read them. But one thing that that kind of caught my eye was this question on voting rolls, and it's kind of a follow-up question on the on their security, the security that goes around that, because that's everyone's basically their personal information. Is there any effort to secure the voting rolls in and of themselves, the folks who have registered and their information? Is that something we should even be concerned about?
We should absolutely be concerned about that. This is something, so it's certainly in Georgia, for the November 2018 election, it was possible for a registered voter to log into the site and get access to just about everything else on the entire rest of the site, because the Secretary of State's security was just unacceptably bad. There are ways to have an online database of the voter roll and yet maintain a pristine copy that you know is secure. And that's the way it should be done. Secretary of State in Louisiana acknowledged this in a panel presentation to the Federal Commission once. I haven't ever been able to get my state commission to acknowledge that they know that this is an issue. But that is an issue. Voter rolls, the one way to change the vote would be to go into heavily Democratic or heavily Republican districts and change 20 or 30,000 addresses so that when people showed up on election day, they'd be in the wrong place. That's not a corruption, but a disruption that suppresses the vote and can change the outcome if you do it in exactly the right places. So yes, we should worry about the security of the voter rolls. That is, in my opinion, the most sensitive part of the current election system.
So several folks have asked this question related to resources, the expense of elections, and you know, that it's okay for them to be expensive because this is very critical in comparison to, you know, it's the basis for our democracy. However, recognizing that they're expensive and that money is tight at the local level, can private citizens donate funds to local election systems? Is it varied state by state? Is that even allowed on a federal level? Does anybody know that?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
No.
I'm not yet faced that problem.
The
I would love to have to make a decision.
Would you like us? Should we do a GoFundMe for you?
The best way to reduce the cost is not to let people buy these new voting computers the way that Georgia and South Carolina have done. Our system cost $51 million and we could have done it for about $30 million if we'd gone to hand-marked paper. Georgia could have done it.
And it's such a politicized process. That's the other point. It's not the most effective or the most efficient or even the most cost efficient. It's a political process. And the lobbyists and others influence the system. And unfortunately, that's what happened. And that's what happened in Georgia. We had, as the professor stated, we paid twice as much as South Carolina. And we didn't get twice as much value.
Well, and this was even after a specifically incorrect statement from, I believe, the Secretary of State, whether it was Kemp or Raffensperger, that paying for the paper would be more costly than buying the hardware. And that was based on 55 cents a ballot at the time that Cobb County's contracts that were in the public domain said 28 cents a ballot. So the numbers were deliberately inflated. Paper is cheaper. It takes 5 or 6 countywide elections every year for 10 years to make up the difference in buying that kind of expensive hardware over buying optical scanners in each polling place and going to hand-marked paper.
Yeah, I was going to add, last year in Guilford County, when we did our petition for the ballots, actually, they did a breakdown of how much it cost in front of everybody. And it was really funny because the chair of the Board of Elections was trying to prove to us that it was better to have the electric ones or the machines. And as he was reading, he was like realizing, oh, this number is actually lower than the machine ballot or whatever. The paper ballots were cheaper. And everyone was like, so why don't you want to get the cheapest option? And then he tried to say they weren't, bring up they weren't reliable, et cetera. But we did wind up getting them.
Yes,
So.
I did those numbers for Guilford.
You said what? I'm so sorry.
I did those numbers for Guilford.
See, you know, he thought you were going to be on his side.
So everybody is asking about the Postal Service. So I will, and we're getting close to wrapping up, so I am going to put it out there. The whole question of the Postal Service and what's been going on, and what can we do to protect and ensure the delivery of ballots, and what can we do from your perspective related to the Postal Service that, well, it's not doing too great right now.
Well, today Trump admitted,
Yes,
and not that I was surprised, he admitted that there is a concerted effort to defund or underfund the Postal Service to negatively impact mail-in voting around the country. And it's just stunning. And I just hope that our leaders in Washington, Republicans and Democrats, will see this as a threat to the American democracy and stand up against this and not allow it to occur and to get the Postal Service the money it needs. Right now, I mail letters to North Carolina. My daughter's there in Raleigh. It's 10 days.
Right.
It's 10 days.
Yeah.
And it's stunning. And all the banks are there in North Carolina. So it's a 10-day turnaround
Right.
with a letter.
I'm sorry, y'all. North Carolina is just, it's never doing the right thing. We're never doing the right thing.
We're down to, it's 8:57. We have 3 minutes. Perhaps we do a lightning round of your best advice for our advocates and our volunteers who are listening. Minute apiece. Okay, Vashti, you first.
Yeah.
And Michael, then Duncan.
Raise a lot of hell. Just because it's COVID doesn't mean you can't blow up somebody's phone or make a petition or, mail in letters to somebody. I think we got to remember there are other ways to organize besides physically putting our bodies at risk all the time. Just raise a lot of hell best way you can from a distance.
Michael.
Remember John Lewis standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Never give up, never give up, never give up. If he could stand there and face the hoses and the horses and the billy clubs, we can fight and defeat the forces that seek to mitigate and suppress the vote in 2020.
Thank you, Michael. Duncan?
I think we have to ask for the absentee ballot as soon as you can. Check that it's been received, that you're going to get it, and get it back as soon as you can. Don't wait. And if there is a way to drop it off, drop it off. I think the real problem is this is not a year when people can wait and hope things work at the end. I've already asked for my absentee ballot, and I called the county today to make sure they had received my request.
See, you got to follow up. Thank you all. Andrea, you want to wrap us up?
I am going to wrap us up. That was an amazing panelist. So, Michael, you and I, we definitely need to talk
Yes.
about the great state of Georgia. We're working on a lot of different things in Georgia. I want to let people know that we have just signed a contract to do billboards there are 125 campuses that are going to be opening in late August. And so we'll be placing billboards on all those campuses. And one of the things we are going to be asking college students to do is consider being a poll worker. As was said here tonight, the younger folks are going to be less susceptible to COVID. They are younger. Many of our states have bought into these really expensive electronic machines that are more complicated than the old ones. So the younger folks are a little more adept at dealing with digital technology. They were born to it. This is where they live. And then also, wouldn't it be great to get the next generation of poll workers started? And in communities of color, wouldn't it be great to have people welcoming folks into the polls to actually exercise a civic responsibility and vote, rather than giving voters the attitude, why are you here? So we think all those things are very, very important. Everyone who's signed up, you will be getting an email from us that will give you a very distinct listing of all the things that you can do. We have sent 4.1 million postcards to voters so far in 2020. I believe we might have another 2, maybe 3 million postcards in it. I've seen questions about texting. We built our own custom texting tool that we are going to use and roll out for early voting. Why? Because our texting tool, if people tell us they want to early vote, it can automatically, based on their county and zip code, tell them where the closest vote center happens to be. 5 of our 8 target states use vote centers. And for many, many of our voters, figuring out where to vote can be problematic. When we postcard normally on a county by county basis. We like to make sure we give voters a website, and we always give them the phone number of their county registrar, because so much information is going to be available from their county registrars. When we look at some of these states, we can see election rules vary on a county by county basis. So it really is important for voters to talk to their county registrar, not the State Board of Elections. That's something that I do with the attorneys. And I got to talk to the North Carolina State Board of Elections today. So I would like to thank you all very, very much for coming. Another thank you, Gabby, Suzanne, and Nancy, for organizing this and putting this together. This has been a great experience for me. I love just sitting in the back, kind of listening and going, yes, this is all very, very great. We have a YouTube channel, and we will be putting this video, after we edit it, we will be moving it out into the YouTube channel for each one of our guests. Your part where you were speaking individually, we will make a separate little video for you that you will have, do whatever you want with it. And at this point, I am going to say thank you all very, very, very much. And good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Talk to you soon, Andrew.
All right. Yeah. Tomorrow.
Good trouble.
Okay. Good trouble. Good trouble.
Oh, yeah.